Okay, here we are again in a podcast on developing, this time sticking still with stories, and in particular the romance story. What I want to do over this series of podcasts is actually take you through the 10 main story types, starting with romance because it's the easiest, but also probably including quests in this particular one because it's very similar. The romance, for those who listened to the earlier podcast, is obviously about a lonely person actually seeing someone and pursuing them to the end. But let's break this down into its key elements. The first part of any romance story is establishing for the audience that the character is actually lonely. This is fundamental to the concept of romance, because what we're relating to is the fact that human beings actually do feel lonely, and romance stories are about somehow coming to terms with that loneliness. Now, in order to solve that loneliness, the character has to actually see an object of desire, i.e. something that potentially can solve that loneliness. Now, this can range from anything from another human being to a beautiful place or an object or a pile of money. The idea is that this thing is somehow going to deal with their loneliness. Now, if they just walk up to this object of desire and they have it immediately, there is no story. In essence, you just have an incident, and this is a mistake many people make when they're actually putting together plots. They merely say, okay, this character's lonely, there's their object of desire, and they essentially just walk up to it, grab it, and lo and behold, the whole story's over. But in fact, there hasn't been a story. Because the essence of any story, and it's true of romance as much as any other, is that there are a series of obstacles between the moment you establish the character's need, their motivation, and the object of desire, the thing that might solve that need, which in a romance is the object of desire. There has to be a number of problems they have to overcome to get to it. And this is how you actually can use a romance story in a narrative that lasts 30 seconds, or in a soap opera for 25 years. Romance stories are, like all stories, expandable. And they expand because of the nature of the problems you actually put in the way between the person's loneliness and their desire to solve that loneliness and their object of desire. So you've got person being lonely, object of desire, number of problems. In that sense, ultimately, they've obviously got to get to that object of desire. Or, having got there, or had the opportunity to obtain that object of desire, they may ultimately not want it. Now, that's the choice of the writer, but the choice over the nature of the romantic elements isn't. If the person never ever reaches that object of desire and has the genuine opportunity to actually obtain it in some way, shape or form, then in essence the audience is being robbed of its sense of completeness on this story, and they will always feel that the writer has actually let them down. And some writers or creators of fiction and narratives may feel, well, you know, you set the audience up, you want to surprise them, we'll rob them of that desire. But in essence, that's easy, and the audience doesn't really appreciate it. They sort of know that you're telling an artificial story. They expect you to be able to deliver on that and then still surprise them, not just rob them of an element and go, aren't I clever, I took an element away. And so in that sense, it's a big mistake to think that you don't actually ultimately need to bring your lonely character to the point where they can at least have a chance of obtaining that object of desire. They may ultimately reject it, or if it's another character who's on a different type of story, they ultimately might reject them. Now, this, of course, is where the plot comes in. And in essence, it's something we will talk about in a later podcast, is that no narrative is just based on one character's story unless it's incredibly short, normally under 30 seconds. Basically, you're always looking at a minimum of 2 stories, but more of that in another podcast. Let's look at the romance story just for a little bit longer before we move on to the quest. Now, in terms of developing the romance idea, there are a couple of other things we can look at. Your character can, of course, be anything. Could be a peanut, could be an alien, it could actually be just any inanimate object. And you actually imbibe it with the concept of being lonely. Now this, of course, can be illustrated in a number of different ways as well. You could, as I did with the Blue Line, give it a tear or a sad violin music. But you could also just so them being literally alone in a space where there's nothing else moving, as was done with Wall-E in Wall-E. Or they could be an individual completely surrounded by loads of other people who are deeply in love, as in many, many romantic comedies, for instance, Four Weddings and a Funeral or Hitch. And then you move on to the object of desire. As I said before, the object of desire doesn't necessarily have to be another human being. It can literally be an object. Or it can in fact be some fantastical creature. Or it can actually be a place that the person's fallen in love with, or believes that obtaining that place, or even a state of mind, is something that is somehow going to deal with their loneliness. Now, as I said earlier, one of the other stories I wanted to look at in this particular podcast was the quest. And the reason I've chosen to talk about the quest alongside the romance, because the two are incredibly similar in structure. The quest, in essence, basically, you have a character who is told to find someone or something, but they're not lonely. They just have to find that someone or something, and they accept that challenge to find them. They go off in search of them, they overcome a number of hurdles, and ultimately they find it, or that person, and they're rewarded for their success in the quest, or not, as the case may be. So very, very similar to the romance story, but without the loneliness and without that satisfaction of loneliness at the end. Instead, it's the satisfaction of finding the thing or the person. All the issues around characterization and the nature of them still apply. Now, in this sense, the quest has also been discussed as being, in some books, as being an overarching plot that actually all modern feature films need to follow. That's not the type of thing I'm talking about here. I am talking about a single character and their story, or one of their stories within a narrative that goes to form the plot. Yes, there are plots that are totally dependent upon quest stories, but not all plots are quest plots. And this is one of the crucial things I want to say at this point in time, that there are many, many narratives that do not have quest stories in them, and they work perfectly well. But actually having a quest story is great when you want to do certain types of film, and in particular things like, for instance, investigative thrillers, where you set someone the task of discovering who was or who were the murderers of a particular character. Or if you want to do certain types of horror story where you actually want, as part of the plot, not as the whole plot, but as part of the plot, one of your characters has to find out what is the thing that will actually destroy the monster. There's a nice quest set up for you. Ultimately they go find it or not, as the case may be. And that may be a storyline that is used only for 10-15 minutes within a narrative that may last 2 hours. And this is the key final point I want to make in this podcast. Stories are used in lots of different ways throughout narratives, but all narratives and all plots are dependent upon them from a structural point of view, because they help the audience understand what the motivation of the character is. Now that's the last thing I want to say in this particular podcast before we move on to the next one and another type of story.